Hi everyone, this is Rohit from Life's Mastery, and I'm excited to have Julio Avalos, who's the founder of Shade News, which brings you daily bites of news and culture. And the mission is to unlock the potential of internet to help people stay informed in a fun and positive way. Julio is ex-chief strategy officer of GitHub. Welcome to the show, Julio.
No, thank you, Rohit. Thanks for having me.
Awesome. So, we had a very interesting chat, and I saw that you have had such a great career in, startups. You work with some really interesting companies. But, let's start from the start. How did you get in this crazy world of startups?
It's a very good question. I somewhat of an unusual path. I am not an engineer. I did like to tinker with websites and early HTML stuff in the 90s, so I was always interested somewhat vicariously in computer science and in technology, but was primarily a liberal arts person. Went
Oh, okay.
to law school. Wasn't sure exactly what I wanted to do with it, but it was just something that had always been recommended to me as a good, just general career path. Practiced general litigation in Manhattan for about a year and really was not enjoying it. Did not feel always aligned with the mission or product or of the vision for a lot of these older institutional clients that you tend to represent when you have a commercial litigation practice in New York. And my wife, then girlfriend, was from the Bay Area. Her
Mm.
father had been an entrepreneur, a tech founder in the 90s of some voice over IP technology, and her family had always sort of been in that space. And I thought I'd give it a shot. So I got recruited by a law firm in Menlo Park back in 2006 that had a brand new client called the Facebook.com.
Yeah.
And the company and their very young CEO had been sued by his Harvard roommates who said that he'd ripped off the idea for the website.
Yeah.
And there was an opportunity to be a junior attorney on what sounded like a pretty interesting, fun case for a fun, interesting client, and certainly more dynamic, I thought, and relevant than the work that I was doing in New York. And we talked a little bit about this previously. The very first time that I set foot in that office, and I felt the energy, I felt the dynamism, and this sense of the work that was being done directly correlating to an impact in the real world, and not just on the real world, but at the real world at scale,
Right.
and feeling like you were making such a positive revolutionary impact. I was completely hooked. And I think that for me, one of the early learnings and something that I think a lot about, and I talk to a lot of startup founders and people who are just beginning their careers about, that it's really important to humanize the companies that we strive to be. I think as tech founders, it's very easy to look at a company like a Google, to look at Facebook, and to view them as monolithic institutions that somehow came out of outer space and just immediately had product market fit and that just became a part of the fabric of our reality. One of the really nice things about being an attorney early on and working with these folks was having this somewhat of an outsider's perspective in meeting with the human beings that were ultimately building this thing for the first time.
Right.
And the empathy, I think, that gets built in when no one has ever built a Facebook before, no one has ever built a Google before. Well, no one has ever built the company maybe that you're working on before either. And you hear a lot about imposter syndrome and such. But at the end of the day, it's human beings that are ideally trying to solve human problems by way of technology for the betterment, not just of the shareholders and the founders, but really the community and society at large. And one of the nice things I think about Shades and what we're trying to accomplish is that it has that similar sense of a positive impact that we're trying to make on the world by, as you said, unlocking the power of online information, particularly for a younger generation of user.
Interesting. And, I just want to follow up about Mark Zuckerberg because, there's a movie made about him. But now if you look at Mark, it's like he's one like once in a generation entrepreneur. He's become suddenly so cool. I mean, he looks so different now and and looks much younger than, what how he used to look 20 years back. But Facebook is such an interesting company now. And, uh, it's it has taken some bolden bets like with buying Instagram and WhatsApp. But what's Mark Zuckerberg as a person? Is he like the how it was portrayed on the social network, or what was it working with him?
So I'll be very honest with you, Rose. I'll tell you, and I get asked this, even though I worked on that case and that represented in some way some conflation of the junior lawyers. I've never seen the movie. It was a
No.
little too close. It was a little too close to home. I get somehow squeamish when I'm seeing it. A bit like hearing yourself, your own voice recorded on something. A little maybe some more distance, and I'll be able to go back and watch it. But in the bits that I've seen, I think that he's not quite in real life as menacing maybe as some of the more, you see this kind of underlying aggression and menacing energy, which was not my experience with him. He's a very, at the time, he's become much more polished, as you said. He's become much more comfortable with the media and in being able to speak to the media on a policy level. At the time, he was very much, I think, a young entrepreneur, a lot of bravado, very thoughtful, idiosyncratic in the way that a lot of tech founders can be, but a brilliant guy who I think from the beginning was quite opinionated with respect to where he saw his business going, the relationship between the private and public that Facebook has always had to deal with in that way, just obviously as a tool that quickly became almost a necessary component of digital life in the early part of the 21st century. And as you said, continues to be through a lot of these other ventures that they've had. But that he was always very savvy, I think, with respect to politics. Facebook was the first company that I saw invest as much early on in having a Washington, D.C. lobbyist policy presence. So it was very sophisticated. Early employees, Elliot, who joined early on as the head of public policy, I think, at the company. A lot of companies weren't thinking about public policy at the time, and we've seen now the Google antitrust, monopoly cases, et cetera, that a lot of these companies have become so large that they end up looking like quasi-public institutions, and you end up with this debate around regulation. But Mark, always a very smart guy, and always, I think, treated us well.
Yeah, it's interesting, and you went on to become this the XCO of GitHub. So how did that experience happen, and yeah, and did it influence you to start with Shades?
Yeah, that's a good question. So originally I went into GitHub. I passed from Facebook. I always just wanted to be closer to the energy, Rohit. It was
Yeah.
clear to me that I wanted to be more involved in decision making, and the only way I thought that was going to happen was to make the leap in-house. So left the law firm dynamic and went to go work at Yelp back in, I think, 2010, a little bit before the IPO, and was there, got to work on the S1, got to see a little bit of how that sausage is made and what life is like pre and post going public, which is interesting. I've got some thoughts on it. There was a group of engineers from GitHub, rather from Yelp, who went to go work at GitHub very early on, pre-Series A. There was a technology that they used, that they were excited about, and GitHub had this aura around it based not just on how popular among this niche of engineers the product was, they also ran themselves in this unique open source type of a way. And I'd say that at GitHub, it was really important for me to have an open mind with respect to what my job was, to how I added value within these institutions. I think it's easy to lose sight, especially when a company starts going through hyper growth and where you think you need to start hiring, well, I need marketers and I need G&A and I need all of these different functions. If a company is going to go out of its way to build out what is essentially, let's take marketing, a boutique bespoke, only one client marketing team, boutique marketing agency, which is really what it is, and the expense that goes along with that, then that marketing agency needs to be as ingrained and as close to the culture of the company so that it can do work at a scale, at an efficiency, and on a level of quality that is not possible if you were outsourcing that work. Otherwise, it doesn't make any sense to be doing it. And that similarly, when I was looking at originally the lawyer and then eventually G&A and then more and more of the operations of the company, it was really important for me, and the culture almost required it at GitHub, that I think of myself not as an attorney that happened to work at this company, but as a GitHub employee who happened to be an attorney. And it seems like somewhat of a maybe very nuanced or subtle type of a shift, but I can guarantee you that when you think of yourself as an employee first, and then think about everything that goes along with that, the values that the company has, the culture that the company has, the mission that the company has, the tone, the brand, the messaging, everything that goes into what it means for me to say, oh, I'm a GitHubber. Oh, I'm a Shades employee. What does that mean? That needs to precede then, and your job needs to be filtered, I think, through that lens, as opposed to, I think, a lot of companies where you end up hiring a senior salesperson that comes in with a playbook that they may have borrowed from their company, a go-to-market function, a market, whatever department it is. Everybody naturally, you expect to come with the experiences that they've gained and to be able to apply that so as to accelerate the hockey stick and the growth curve and the learning that you have within the current enterprise. However, if you're not tailoring that work to the work that's being done at this specific place, first and foremost, then I think that we're naturally leaving a lot of value undiscovered and untapped. And that was really something that when I think back at GitHub, the culture that was created there, where early on, Rohit, the company probably went 300 to 400 employees before we instituted a typical organizational structure for the first maybe 4 or 5 years, including raising a $100 million Series A, one of the largest Series A's in the history of tech. And we operated like an open source structure. So what that meant was that it was largely decentralized. It wasn't quite consensus-based decision-making, but it was open and transparent decision-making. And it was an early, not just a flavor, but for me, also an early example of remote culture, where when I joined the company in 2012, it was already almost entirely remote. 80–90% of the company worked from home, which was unusual at the time. But again, when you thought about what GitHub did, the whole point of GitHub was decentralized collaborative software development. And so in order to dog food almost that, in order to have that show up in the most authentic way in the product, we always thought that we got a lot of value by working in a decentralized way, using the tool in order to build the product and to build the company. And that was also something I think that hopefully here I learned along the way before the pandemic. I think a lot of folks have had to adjust to remote life, and there are lots of interesting things and challenges that come along with particularly being a startup founder or early company leader in this remote world. Questions of morale, questions of how do you maintain culture? How do you maintain productivity? How do you maintain all of these things that are necessary and required of building a successful business? A lot of that, I think I was lucky to be able to have cut my teeth at GitHub and learned several things around the way around what worked and what didn't work.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think it's super interesting. In the last couple of years, I've seen a lot of companies now find it normal to have a remote culture, but also, when it comes to content, what I've seen since pandemic is this lot of content, and with new platforms like TikTok and Instagram, just mindless scrolling of content with low nutrient content is happening. But what led you to start Shade News, and why was the focus around Gen Z and millennials for you?
Sure. So like a lot of folks, it started during the pandemic. My co-founder, partner, and wife, Sonali Maitra, who's always been the the news junkie, the culture vulture, professor down at Stanford, and in her previous life, a trial lawyer, actually.
Mm.
And during the pandemic, she was the one that was primarily doing the legwork to try and get at the answers to so many of the questions that we were asking ourselves at the time about social distancing, eventually about the vaccine, about different medications, prophylactic, what should you be doing, long COVID, all of these different things that were happening during that year. And little by little, Sonali for our social group, and then eventually radiating into larger circles, was the one that people were coming to and saying, like, hey, Sonali, what do you think about, what do you think about this? And when I saw the amount of time that was being spent on the research to not just triangulate, but quadrangulate around multiple sources, and that what she realized for herself, where having to do the legwork, hitting all of the paywalls, nobody's doing that in today's day and age. I think that we
Yeah.
see that journalism is an industry that has been in massive transition for the better part of the last couple of decades and really accelerated over the last 10 to 15 years. No one has time to read even a single 3,000 word article, let alone be able to do the research to read multiple versions of that story. And then if you think about how difficult it is to find different perspectives that
Yeah.
are equally, let's say, credible, then you're talking about a full-time day job that people have and that they don't have the time to do, they don't have the expertise to do. And we saw that there was a gap in the market. So it really got started from the pandemic. After that,
Mm.
and the connection to young people in particular, when we started doing a lot of research early on whether there was a viable product and business model to be had in solving a problem that I think everyone recognized. There was no one really that I've ever spoken to in the US, in Europe, Asia, India in particular is a big place where we've had a lot of positive response. Everyone recognizes, I think, that at a certain stage, the news problem and the issue of how to stay informed in an age of echo chambers, bots, fake news, misinformation, and even well-intentioned false information that exists online without getting into intentionally false information that's happening, everyone nods their head and recognizes that this is a problem. And it feels like an intractable problem or one that is difficult to solve. At Shades, we've tried to solve it. When we were talking to young people in particular, and maybe this has been your experience as well, one of the things that we've seen, especially with college-aged and younger folks, let's take generally Gen Z and Gen Alpha,
Yeah.
they're much more idiosyncratic, polyglot when it comes to how they view the world, how they view themselves. They begin
Mm.
from a place that assumes that I cannot be simply categorized in some kind of a top-down way. So for instance, for me coming up in the 80s and in the 90s, you would pick, I'm a liberal, I'm a Democrat, I'm a Republican. You kind of identify, I'm a rock kid, I'm a hip hop kid, I'm an immigrant kid. You sort of, I think, had a tendency to start with some sort of an identity label in the 80s and in the last part of the 20th century, and to allow that to then sort of organize and structure the way that I view the world. What are the traditional Democratic positions? What are the traditional conservative positions? And that's sort of where I go. For young people today, what we found and what I see with my children and just interacting with a lot of people in this age demographic, it's much more bottoms up. You're
Yeah.
much more I think, skeptical of a label, of limiting yourself in some way. From a fashion standpoint, you see that when I was growing up, there was the preppy kids, there was the kids that dressed in this way, there was kind of the emo kids, there was the nerdy kids, whatever it happened to be, but you sort of hung out with a clique and you identified and looked in a particular way. In 2024 and beyond, one day my daughter wakes up and dresses a little preppier, another day she's dressing in a different way, wigs, different hairstyles, etc. So you see that on a superficial fashion artistic way, there is this much more polyvalent, diverse way of representing who you are. And
Right.
that we would see that that actually carried through to then how they viewed the world and what information they wanted to take and how they fell on particular issues. So we'd ask questions where we would get responses that in one breath would be traditionally progressive or left leaning on different issues such as privacy or cookies or tracking or their online kind of big brother world. They would give positions that were much more libertarian and wanting to be left alone and wanting people to, not be poking in and looking at what they were doing. And so they were all over the place, really.
Yeah.
And we thought that there was a real gap there, that they wanted multiple perspectives on the issues. They recognized that you could disagree even with yourself, let alone other people, and still be a rational type of a reasonable person. And so I think that both the arc of history has moved from one of disjunction, so are you for this or are you for that, increasingly to I'm for this and I'm for that, but I'm also kind of responding to that position that you're saying. And that level of nuance and shade simply doesn't show up in any of our online political discourse, current events, information. And so for me, Shades is currently focused primarily on giving you multiple perspectives on the news and the issues of the day. We have a team that goes out and curates that. Also, we've been starting building in some supplemental work from generative AI in order to look for these different perspectives in a hybrid model on that front, which is interesting. And I think that the rate and pace of technology over the last 18 months has really helped us to unlock a lot of that when it comes to generating more content. But that in the 21st century, and I think that more and more, the world will be much more like this and wanting to see different dots that can be connected in order to reveal the shape of the underlying reality that is below it. And that Shades is more of almost a confirmation, I think, of the direction that things are moving in, and not such a radical reinvention of information. We think that this is really the way, the future, not just for news and current events, but in just getting up to date on all online information, period, full stop. These people say this, these people say this. You kind of make up your own opinion on what you think is going on.
Interesting. I want to follow up about, curating content. How do you go about, curating content, especially with generative AI and other tools? I think my writing, I would like to believe my writing has improved a bit, but when it comes to curating there's not any bias reporting or fake news when you're trying to curate it for the Gen Zs.
Sure. So number one, I think that's why we have this hybrid model, where if we were just giving it to a robot to do on its own, I would be concerned, at least with the current state of the technology. And I think that it's nice to have this human oversight ultimately on what's happening, and different issues have different levels and allocations of human first versus bot first, or whatever it happens to be. The issue of bias becomes, well, multiple issues and responses. Number one, when you have multiple perspectives, then the fact that any one individual perspective is biased becomes less of a bug and more of a feature. So when you're able to look at multiple biased positions, then that's really where you start to kind of see, okay, at least where the differences land. And in most cases, what we find is that there is some kind of underlying truth that everyone seems to agree on, but then there's the spin that ends up getting put on it. So early on, I think that we would talk about trying to remove the bias that existed in media. Our thinking evolved pretty quickly when we were building out the product, we weren't trying to remove bias. We were just trying to make it easier for you to find multiple different biases, if you're going to put it in that way, right? The issue of credibility is another important one. So it's not a perfect science. I think that ultimately this is where human judgment, where some of the stuff that we were talking about, what are the values of the company, what are the sources that you're actually going to bother even telling people about. I happen to be of the opinion that usually more information is better than less information, and that even a totally ridiculous fringe off the wall position, when rather than being suppressed and censored, ends up revealing itself as ridiculous and fringe once it's properly contextualized within a number of other opinions. And I think that we try, and one of the nice things I think about the product and with Shades is that we try and intentionally put these perspectives almost in dialogue with one another. So Rohit says that doing 100 push-ups first thing in the morning is the best thing that you can do, But Julio says that you don't need to do that many and that it could actually lead to all kinds of problems. But then look at this opinion from the Wall Street Journal that's somewhere in between. So we always try and not just throw them out there to leave our users to figure them out for themselves. We intentionally craft, I think, a little bit of a narrative in each one of these topics to make it that much easier to not just get the multiple perspectives, but to do it quickly. Because that's the other problem I think that we have in today's culture. Nobody wants to spend even minutes. You know, you want to put it on that level. Even a 4.5 minute video or a 4.5 minute read or something like that in this day and age feels entirely either decadent or unnecessary, and in any case, usually inefficient. And so we try and draft this stuff in language that's just not just colloquial, but fast and that resonates as authentic for the audience that it's intended to be for, which is this younger demographic. And so the content team, which are a group of full-time employees that we have that are going out and not just researching the topics, but coming up with what the topic should be, what are the issues of the day, they're all college age or recently graduated out of college age and below, to be able to make sure that we're not crafting language that isn't that isn't going to resonate with the intended user.
Got it. Interesting. And I've seen there's been a rise of one-person media companies, especially I'm a fan of Jason Calacanis, Lenny's newsletters, Harris Ebbings from 20VC, and I see more and more people are building these sort of media companies. Where do you think would be the future of legacy media companies like TechCrunch or New York Times? Do you think the model has been so different for these legacy media companies where they had 300 reporters and they were pretty reliant on sponsorships? Where do you think it's going for these media companies?
I think that we're due to see a lot of consolidation still in that space. I think that it's correct to call them media companies. You know, it's interesting, and I've tried to catch myself recently, but it's very easy in this day and age to view all information, regardless of it is, as content. You know,
Yeah.
like we need to be creating more and more content. And I think that media companies view themselves as creating content. And then the question happens to be, what is the point of this content? Who's the audience for? And is it sufficiently differentiated from anything that anyone else is putting out there? And
Yeah.
so when you look at the size that we used to have in terms of these larger companies, you're right that I think it's very difficult to imagine that you need 500 journalists in a contemporary news organization. More and more, we see what I think that Shades is able to do, which is to benefit from the almost user-generated, media-generated content that exists out there that is being completely untapped, rather than trying to create new first-party content. I think that primarily we think that the problem that we have in today's day and age isn't one of volume. It's certainly not one of we don't have enough perspectives and I need to hire a new beat reporter in order to cover the X, the financial perspective on whatever is going on in my local town or whatever it is. Someone else out there is probably already doing that work for you. And so it just on the question of margins, it doesn't make sense to be hiring a lot of this work out there. Primarily, the problem that we have is that the information already exists, but that nobody can find it. No one has able to source it, to curate it, to determine whether or not it's credible, to verify it, you could say in that way. And so I do think that Shades, together with a lot of these, with new media that we see, are trying to unlock this question of how do we just make it easier to deal with the stream of information that is already coming at us and that is incredibly overwhelming. I think that Shades is unique insofar as we're building something that has an immediate appeal and attraction to a demographic that typically is not interested in your news and your journalism, but that is incredibly interested in consuming new media, and that is almost rapacious with respect to how much new information they want. And so for Shades, it's not a question of trying to rip and replace TikTok or Instagram or even X or Twitter. We think that we sit adjacent to those platforms and that we provide a palate cleanser of sorts. For us, it was very important that we didn't want to be necessarily the first ones to be able to have coverage on a particular story. We thought that it was important to have a bit of that lag, to have a little bit of that delayed gratification, such as it is, to be able to see what are the perspectives that are going on, what are the reasonable takes that exist out there, and what are the salient points that our readers and that our users need in order to better understand this particular issue and to feel more confident about what's going on. And for us, it's interesting how there's a lot of anxiety when it comes to young people and information. They recognize that they're not reading the news. They recognize that the information that they're getting may be biased, but they feel trapped with respect to where they would go in order to find out these different takes. And I think that I don't know what your perspective is, but on my perspective, what ends up happening, I think not just among young people, but just generally in society, is that because things have become so overwhelming and because it's not easy and it's not fun, the tendency is to check out altogether, which from a place of civics and for the betterment of society also doesn't seem like the right solution for everyone to just kind of drop out and leave the decision making, the policy making, and the coverage of what's happening to the people that are at the fringes that are motivated enough by their particular take and inclination to be participating in civic discourse. And so we didn't want people to be dropping out altogether and wanted to be able to provide just another tool really for being a citizen in the 21st century and how you stay informed and how you stay up to date. And we think that we're unlocking a better way of doing that.
Interesting. And Julio, have you thought about the revenue model? Is it going to be like ads and sponsorship, or would you want to focus more on increasing the user base for now?
Right now, the 100% on the latter, really focusing on increasing the user base. One of the reasons I think that you end up taking venture capital in the way that we have in angel early investing is to be able to let the product develop and breathe, to be able to find adoption, to be able to find product market fit without unnecessarily trying to stifle that oxygen that you need for growth with some immature monetization, advertising, et cetera. I think that we're still testing and looking at where the market shakes down in terms of subscription versus advertising, et cetera, what that would look like. I do think that there's a real opportunity where young people in particular, I think, have less of an allergy to being marketed to or to seeing advertisements because, again, these things are just content too. And if you see the ads that larger brands, luxury brands, and kind of medium size and above enterprises do on TikTok, for instance, the advertising that they're running on TikTok is very different than the advertising that they would be running through some larger Google ads, DoubleClick type of a program, or what they would be doing on a different platform. They're tailoring their content into something that is native and consumable and interesting and attractive to the audience that they're trying to speak to. Which isn't revolutionary marketing, but that does seem to have kind of disappeared and gotten lost a little bit around the way over the last 15, 20 years. Similarly, I think that there is a way of doing advertising in brand in the future for Shades that feels authentic to the overall look and feel, to the brand, to the messaging, to the point of what we have. And I think that in my experience, users not just aren't necessarily allergic to it, but almost welcome it, provided that they're also getting something from it, provided that it's tailored. At the end of the day, go-to-market motion sales is ultimately just about connecting people with products that they actually want and that they're going to get value out of, and that ideally it's multi-sided in its generation of value. And that's ultimately what I think that we want to be targeting in the future. But right now, the goal is really to focus on growth, to focus on the user, the persona that we're going after, that we're creating this content for, and making sure that they see it as valuable, that they perceive it as something that they want to share, and that they're better off for using rather than not.
Interesting. And you mentioned about content consumption. I was just wondering, do you have any insights about Gen Zs and Gen Alphas? What platforms are they using to consume content? Are they looking at new platforms like Snapchat and TikTok, and how and are they still on platforms like Instagram and Facebook to consume those sort of content?
So it's a great question. One of my co-founders, Jeff Grimes, he joined from Google. So he was actually a senior PM who was working on the Google Discover feed, and it was interesting his perspective on the different online search habits of young folks and how something that for me, he gave, I remember in one of our early conversations, he gave the example of take a question like how old is Barack Obama? You and I, above a certain age, would probably see that as a natural question that it's very interesting, very easy to just put into a search engine. How tall is Barack Obama? I get an answer within seconds. When they would do tests, and in his experience, what they would see is that even a question like that would be asked within TikTok and looking for a talking head. How old is Barack Obama? Someone somewhere maybe has created a video for it. And it was only after you hadn't found it on your default social media platform that if you were still motivated enough to try and figure out what the answer to the question is, maybe you start thinking about going to some of the traditional channels that millennials and above associate with doing their research online. So 100%. We found that young people were primarily looking for not just entertainment content, but again, news content. And again, I think for older folks, it's important to break ourselves out of this paradigm. It's all just content increasingly to people. There's factual content, there's entertainment content, there's advertising content, there's marketing content, there's music content. But we're increasingly, I think, within younger generations in particular, living within a more and more undifferentiated soup of just content. And I need to figure out just how I make sense of all of it. And so I do think that young people do view it in that world, and we're doing their research on TikTok primarily, I think, is where we see it. One of the early inspirations for me as we were thinking about building out Shades was the partner that ByteDance has in China that doesn't have a Western equivalent, a product that they have by the name of Toutiao. Toutiao, billions of users, incredible engagement that they have within domestic China. That is almost a feed like a TikTok, but more news, entertainment, current events, information that you would be streaming through. And it struck us that there was no alternative within the United States or within Europe, really, of that product. And that's something interesting that I think for a lot of entrepreneurs and venture, that even though if, let's say, over the last 18 to 24 months, given the cooling political climate that exists between the West and within China, there's less of an interest in investment in China, et cetera. There are lots of companies where 10 to 15 years ago, everything was the copycat within China of some European or Western or American equivalent, the X of China. This is like the eBay of China or whatever it happens to be. Yeah. More and more, there are companies that exist at scale in China that we should be learning from. And Toutiao was one of those early examples for me about the potential that existed at hyper growth and at hyper scale for a product that was giving you fun, curated news and information updates. And that was a major source, I think, of early inspiration for us, was looking at Toutiao and the fact that that was validation that there was an interest in this. I do think that there is an appetite, though, for something that is fun and entertaining, but that's also a little bit, to use your language from the beginning, a little bit more higher calorie, a little bit more substantive. But the question that they run into without Shades is, how do I get that without either A, investing significant time into researching, reading, hitting paywalls, or just maybe even I'd make it halfway through an article only to recognize that this is really a different perspective. This is just the same perspective that I just read in the last article. That's a very difficult problem to solve for, because you kind of have to get into it before you recognize what the perspective is on a particular piece. And so we do think that there's an appetite for getting their information somewhere else. The somewhere else just doesn't exist.
Interesting.
Before Shades hadn't existed. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So for context, I'm a millennial, but I've now replaced Google search with Perplexity and ChatGPT. But do you see Gen Zs and maybe with Gen Zs, have they, changed the habits of searching to generative AI tools, or they've taken to, social media channels to search for content?
It's a good question. I think that we're still in the early days, but you definitely see greater fluency and native use among younger online users and the AI platforms in order to get answers to questions. The problem, again, with that is that ChatGPT, if you take that as an example, I can ask ChatGPT a question, and the answer that I get, I'm not sure, number one, whether the information is still dynamic and live and relevant as of today, given the limitations that they have with respect to when they loaded all of the information within the machine. So number one, you're going to have this latency issue where it's not particularly good, and in some cases just simply doesn't work with current events and issues of the day. So that's number one. Number two is that I think that ChatGPT is going to suffer from the same, and even in an acute way, a lot of the bias problems that you have when you're looking at any one particular news source. It's unsighted. You don't have footnotes telling you where it's found this information. In a lot of cases, it might be building an answer where it's completely just kind of hallucinating something and is pulling information that we've seen that is either misleading or just flatly objectively incorrect. There are plenty of examples. As the technology improves, we expect that to go down. But however, it's still, at the end of the day, a single perspective that you're getting on an issue that also suffer. I have no idea where this is coming from. I have no idea what the source for this information was. And so I think that ChatGPT is nice for certain types of projects and for getting certain types of information, or maybe a start on a larger research project. It can lead you to down the right path at the beginning. I use ChatGPT. I like it for just having some kind of initial perspective of what exists out there, and then I see it as a starting point, and usually not as an end-all and be-all. But you do see young people increasingly using it. The problem with it is that I think that it suffers from a lot of the same issues that traditional news and media has.
Got it. And you've been part of a lot of legacy companies, but what are some of the biggest mistakes early stage founders make when they are telling stories and pitching to VCs? Yeah.
It's a great question. We were just yesterday talking about fundraising and financing and what we've learned so far along the path and what we might be doing differently in the future. One, I think, very clear, easy thing that I see entrepreneurs and early startup founders, the mistake that they make is they don't have an easy and crisp and rational answer to why are you raising capital in the first place? Yeah. Or why are you raising this much capital in the first place? What does it imply about your future business? What does it imply about the monetization that you need to hit? Have you thought this through? Where are you going to spend that money? And I think that if the answer, particularly early on, is on anything other than R&D, engineering capacity, building into the product, better understanding the user, making sure that we have product market fit, everything else should be looked at incredibly skeptically. And certainly, I think that one thing that I've seen in my own career and mistakes that I've made along the way is that when you have a great idea, and usually we think if we're going through the work of building out a company and investing this much of ourselves and then selling other people and asking them to invest in this vision and all of the responsibility that goes along with that, if you have this great idea, you want other people to know about it. You want the validation of environmental success, and you want to get it into people's hands. And so there's a tendency to rush a product out, I think, prematurely. Mm-hmm. In order to start finding that validation and those success, and maybe this thing gets traction and takes off organically, and then we're off to the races. And wanting to spend a lot at that top of the funnel, as such as it is, before you've properly understood the mid funnel, the bottom of the funnel, looking at things at least on a consumer side, but frankly, it's equally applicable on an enterprise side. Do we have what we need in order to prevent churn? Do we think that we've got the right model in order to retain whoever it is that we're going to get eyeballs and bring in with all of this venture capital that we just happen to raise? And so I think that having a certain amount, if not a great amount, of patience with respect to how you're deploying your capital, how you're building out the product, how you're striking the right balance between external less validation that you're on the right track, but just research, I think in the early days is definitely something that Jeff in particular has brought to the founder group, is this greater discipline and rigor that he used at Google in terms of A/B testing different features, different products, different models, not being overly attached, I think also to assumptions that you have with respect to why your business exists in the first place, and striking the difficult balance and walking that razor's edge between being committed to this North Star values and principles that you have and the reason for being for your product and your company, that the world, presumably, if you're building something that is truly has the potential to go global and to get scale and to go viral in that way and that deserves to exist, you're almost by definition creating something that is new and that expresses a perspective that no other product and no other company maybe has out there in the market. And so there is a certain amount of just blind faith that is required and optimism that is required in a founder mindset, and you need to stick to that. However, there are any number of points where you do need to make sure that you're not blindly just fixated on, it's just a matter of time and we just kind of need to put our head in the sand and just continue down this path. What is the right room for external feedback, listening to the users? That's critically important. I think that making sure that you're properly even aware of those different push and pulls and tensions that exist within building an early business, I think that that's also a necessary thing that you need to keep an eye on and that people have an insufficient eye on. Although I do think that there has been such a dramatic market correction, Rohit, in terms of raising capital at this day and age compared to what you saw 10, 15, 20 years ago, that really you need to be much more disciplined with respect to the monetization strategy, how you're going to operate, how you're going to remain efficient, CAC to LTV type ratios that an early founder never used to have to think about until they were getting into their B round and farther down the line. You need to have answers to these questions now almost at a seed level if you're kind of being able to raise capital and to do so responsibly. And so I do think that that's another thing that early founders need to recognize, is that they need to be much more business sophisticated and rooted in reality while still having the enticement of this optimistic kind of vision for what the company could be. All right, but then let's reverse engineer that thing. And what are we actually doing along this near-term horizon? And tell me how you're going to make use of my money. That's something that people and entrepreneurs need to just have to be much more disciplined about. And I think they've had to be over the last 2 to 3 years, where it's been a relatively difficult, I would say, early stage market.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And what I've seen in the last couple of years, it's become easier to create content using AI tools. And there's been an explosion of content in the last couple of years. But do you think it's going to be the same for creating products? Do you think you'll have 100x software products coming out using AI tools? And do you think degrees like computer science are going to be relevant in next 5 to 10 years from now?
So I think so. I think from now, given the progress that the last couple of years, I tend to be, I think, somewhat conservative with my views on the role of
Hi, sorry, can you hear me? Start recording.
Okay. So I think it's a great question with respect to what the role of AI is going to be in building products moving forward. Early on at GitHub, it was interesting. One of my roles there, as I left the legal scope and the G&A scope and was stepping in more into the strategy and the operational oversight of the company, one of some of the value I think that I added was this outsider's perspective on what GitHub was. And I'll just use GitHub as an example. And the founders had built a version control tool that made it easier for people to collaborate on code and to build software together. From my perspective, coming into it, it wasn't just a dead repository of code. It was a living, breathing cartography of every bug that had ever been written and every fix that had ever been written to patch up that bug. And that in as early as 2014, 2015, maybe earlier, I was trying to push the engineers into leveraging how can we better leverage the scale of information that we have, all of this data that we have, as I said, with every bug and every fix and every discussion that's ever gone into writing this code. The next time that somebody goes to write that bug, we should be able to flag it, as in 95% of the times that we've seen code like what you just wrote, it's going to break. And in 88% of the times where there was that bug, it was fixed by way of code largely represented by this sample over here. And what I was articulating was not really, I had no concept of LLMs or generative AI or whatever it was happening to be, but it was just this kind of somewhat simpleton observation that if we knew what the problems were, and then we also knew what the solutions were, and we knew this at scale, that we should be able to leverage that in order to anticipate those problems and to better inform future users of those solutions. And I think that similarly, anytime that we are building a product and there is some repetitive scaffolding element to it that is by definition external to the core value proposition of what I am working on and what I think is differentiated about my product, that is always a place to look for in terms of, am I doing the right pro-con analysis in terms of whether it makes sense for me to be building that thing right now or whether I should be buying it from the outside. And similarly, I think that for AI is increasingly going to replace the latter part of that choice, which is I don't necessarily need to go out and buy this thing. Am I able to piece together different elements and components that already exist on GitHub or otherwise in order to get this product out to market faster? The closer you are from the penumbra, where I think that AI and generative tools are increasingly good at, the closer you get to your core differentiated reason for existing, the more unlikely I think it is that the product is going to be able to replace human judgment, human innovation, or whatever it happens to be, or at a minimum, it's the place where you need, similar to what Shades is doing, more of this hybrid approach where you're making sure that you've got human beings that are working in connection with the technology that exists in order to arrive at the most efficient product and use. I think we're a longer ways away from Skynet and the robots taking over the world than where people were afraid. I think earlier in the year and in late last year where there was a lot of concern, I think when OpenAI was coming up about stealing jobs and all of these things, I do think that we're in for some sort of a reckoning where, again, work that is more repetitive, work that is almost, you could use the word robotic by definition, a lot of that work may go away. And hopefully it's giving way to human beings being free to do more interesting, more creative, or more necessary work that human beings are actually good at doing. But we'll just have to see. I think it's a very interesting time to be building a company. It's an interesting time to think about what AI exists out there. And certainly I test out different things around creating PowerPoint presentations. Do I really need to do this? There's some interesting companies that exist out there. So anything that I do that I think is not unique to me, I do now try and look outside and see whether there's something that I could be doing to just become more efficient and just get some of my time back. But outside of that, I'm still somewhat of a skeptic, I think, in terms of where AI is going to change our lives, certainly over the course of the next 18 to 24 months.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And, I quickly want to do the top three. What's your favorite business book?
My favorite business book, I think 0 to 1 is a very good one that I think that people should read. I also have been citing a lot recently to one of my investors is Ben Horowitz's The Hard Things About Hard Things, which I think has a lot of very good practical advice on a number of different issues. And you asked for one, but I can never give it. It's shades, so I have to triangulate on multiple perspectives on it. The other one that I think is quite good is Laszlo Bock's Work Rules, which is his early tips from the HR perspective and building out Google. I think it has a lot of really fascinating and important things when it comes to performance management, hiring practices, different elements of the business, which are not always the most interesting. And I think that people and founders tend to discount to a certain extent. But at the end of the day, the people that are building your company are the most important thing that you've got going on, and figuring out how you work with them and manage them and optimize the work that they're doing and their quality of life, I think is absolutely critical to building a company in the 21st century.
Yeah, no, absolutely. We'll put that in the show notes. And if you could go back in time when you started at building Shades, what is the one thing you would have focused on or done anything differently?
It's a great question. Number one, I think that I would have taken some of my own advice from this conversation and spent less in exploratory paid marketing efforts and spent more time in it's a line actually in a theme that Horowitz has in the Hard Things About Hard Things book. There are no silver bullets. There are only lead bullets in this business. And I think that I maybe was guilty at the beginning of looking for silver bullets into growth when there is no replacement for the lead bullets. It's grinding, it's getting out there and doing the work, talking to your users constantly, devotedly, rigorously, focused on improving the product, and then testing out, obviously increasing the stream of eyeballs that you get on it, but really focusing on churn, focusing on retention, and focusing on improving the product rather than wanting to get the thing out there and kind of expecting that you might have a hole in one right out of the bat.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think early stage is a lot of grind. So yeah, no, totally resonate. And do you have any favorite online tool, for example, Gmail, Slack, Zoom, anything other than Shades News?
Figma slides, interestingly, is something that I've been playing around with as a potential alternative to Keynote or even Google slides, which I've been using. I think that the presentation in the deck is a remarkably uninterrogated, underappreciated space of innovation that is required, both in terms of just the raw, how do I make a presentation that's more engaging? How do I make something that is actually leading to greater insights and to greater absorption of information that get me to an answer to a necessary question? That I think is an interesting management kind of corporate organizational challenge that we're still just figuring out. At GitHub, I used to wonder whether we ought not to centralize the deck creation function rather than just assuming that, again, in the spirit of, I'm not a lawyer and then a GitHub employee or a Shades employee. I'm a Shades employee that happens to be a lawyer or that happens to be a marketer or whatever. Just because I happen to work at this company does not mean that I should also, and that I'm a great marketer well, marketer maybe is not correct. The fact that I'm a great engineer doesn't necessarily mean that I'm going to be the best person at building out the right deck, the right presentation, and knowing how information should be organized. There should be experts. So I've always been a believer in the professionalization of the presentation and this information. Bezos at AWS has this great thing around meetings and really preferring and necessary the requirement of a written piece of work product that everyone has pre-read. Then we go in and we're having a very short conversation where we're not talking about anything. Nothing should be new in the meeting. We're here to make a decision and to kind of talk out what needs to be spoken about. And that's one thing I do think that remote first entrepreneurs need to keep in mind. If we're having a meeting, as opposed to doing something asynchronously, why are we doing that? And is the reason actually related to what is whatever unique to a human-to-human interaction, and that cannot be had within a written thread, or that is much more less efficient within a written thread, or kind of people are not understanding the tone or whatever it happens to be. Any number of reasons for having a real live meeting, but I do think that there isn't enough discipline when it comes to just defaulting to the meeting, defaulting to the deck. And so anything that kind of helps in terms of productivity, information, visualization, et cetera, is something that I'm always trying to find a new and better tool for.
Yeah, no, absolutely. We'll put that in the show notes. And what's the best way people can reach out to you and know more about Shades News?
Yeah, just for folks that have access to the Apple App Store, you just search Shades. You can go there. Shadesnews.com is the website, and I'm always happy to speak to anyone. I'm just Julio at shades.news. You can email me. You can reach out on LinkedIn. We're always interested in new markets, talking about information, media literacy, just generally. Again, it's an issue in the UK. It's the issue domestically. It's an issue everywhere. And so it's really a global problem that we think that we're tackling. But for now, I'd urge everyone to just go and check out Shades and to let us know what you think. Always happy for the feedback.
Yeah, no, absolutely. We'll put that in our show notes. Julio, thank you so much for taking our time and speaking to us. I really enjoyed my conversation with you.
Thank you, Rohit. I enjoyed it as well. Appreciate the time.